powers are not a gift.
So it turns out Rock has worked out so hard. Now he can generate lightning from his hand. I am no Rock, but I do know how to generate lightning. Yes, in this video I will cover all the basics from start to finish you need to know to create different types of lightning effects. One that is just a branch and one that strikes to any given direction. One that uses new short path nodes. And don't forget the one that slides along any surface. Cool, right? But we have to start from here. I'm going to show you how to create this lightning branch, how to distort it, how to smooth the distortion, how to animate it, how to control its speed, the radius, and transferring those data between materials and geometry. It's a lot, so let's get started. Let's start by adding a plane object. This will be our geometry node object. I call it lightning branch. Rename the collection to. This object will be our lightning and its origin point will act as the lightning branch starting point. Let's add an empty object to be our target point. Place it to the side. And we all set to start our geometry node setup. Now select our lightning branch object, add a geometry node modifier. You can add that from here as well. Give it a name. I remove this connection by Ctrl right click drag through the noodle. We don't need our initial geometry, so delete this. To create our lightning branch, first I start by adding a curve primitive curve line. This node gives us two methods of creating a curve line object, points method and direction method. To create a line between 2 points, you can use the points method. And direction method allows you to create a line to a certain direction. And we have this length to control how long the curved line is going to be. For a directional branch, we will use this direction method. But today, we want our lightning branch to stick to 2 points. So, let's switch over to the points method. We already have our 2 points. Lightning branch origin or its pivot point will be our start point and our target object will be the end point. So let's drag the target object to the node setup. This will create a reference to our target object. You can do the same by going to input object info and selecting the target object from here. I keep this as empty for now. Hit F2 to rename this node to target. Set this to relative because I want this to update with any changes we will make to the target object. Now drag the location from our target to the end socket. This will make the endpoint of the curve stick to the target object. I pin this window so it won't change when I select a different object. And here in the 3D view, when I move the target object, you can see it's working nicely. Now you can see our start point is also working, but just to make sure it will always work, I drag the location from this empty object info node to the start point. This will make a reference to self object. Set that to relative as well. Right now we only have 2 points in the curve. You can see that here in the spreadsheet as well. But we certainly need more points to create a distortion in the branch. To add more points to the curve, I add curve resample curve node. By default, it will change our curve to have 10 points. We can change that from here. Let's set it to 12 for now. Well, wise man once said, if you always wait to organize your nodes, you won't be able to find them later. So let's organize them before it becomes a mess. Select all these nodes and hit Shift P to create a frame. F2 to rename. Call it Lightning Branch. Hit N to bring up this panel, and here in the Node tab, you can change the frame settings. Now let's create a distortion. To distort or displace any geometry, not just curves, we can use Geometry Set Position node. I put it here. You can change this offset to displace the curve. But this is not just a one value input. This is a field input. You can set different offsets to each point of the curve. To do that, I use a noise texture node. This will give us different values based on a texture. I plug the color to offset. Immediately, you can see it distorted our curve. You can change the values to get different distortions. Now put your attention to this. I go to top view and mute this node by hitting M key. You can see the curve line before it gets distorted. Now when I unmute it, you can see all of our points only offset to positive X and Y. I go to the front view and it is the same here on the Z axis. It is offset only in the positive direction. That is because by default, noise texture only gives us values between 0 and 1. So to distort our curve in both positive and negative directions, we have to remap the 0 to 1 value range. For that, we can use map range node. But since we are using color output, let's set the data type to vector. Put it here. We need to map the 0 to 1 value coming from the texture to -1 to 1. See, now our distortion happens in every direction. Let's control the strength of our distortion. For that, we can use multiply node. But since these are vector values, to get the best result, I have to use a vector node. So let's delete this and drag from here and search for scale and select this vector map scale node. This will basically work like a multiply node, but for vectors. Here, instead of 3 values, we can use this one scale value to multiply all 3 axes. But this introduced us to an issue. Since we are distorting every single point, our origin point and end point are also distorted from their position. We want them stick to their position. So we have to tell the set position node to not to distort the start and end point. One way we can do that is by getting a curve endpoint selection node. This node helps us to mask points from each end of the curve. Let's use the default values, which selects one point from each end. Now drag the selection to this selection socket. This will only distort those 2 points in each end, but we want the opposite of it. Since this is a Boolean output, we can use a Boolean math node to do that. In this case, the not math node. This will reverse our selection and do the job nicely for us. But this has a slight issue, which is that the next point from each end is going to have the full effect of the distortion. In other words, towards each end, our displacement of the curve could look very harsh, not smooth at all. With Boolean math nodes, we can't create those smooth fall-offs. So let's delete these 2 nodes and use a different method. Let's use curve spline parameter node. If you have followed my previous Geo Node videos, you know exactly what this does. It creates a 0 to 1 value range from start to end of a curve. If we use this with our scale node, we will be able to get a smooth follow. So I will duplicate the scale node and plug this factor to one of them. Now you can see the start of the curve has no displacement, but the end of the curve has full displacement. But we want full displacement at the middle and 0 at each end, and smooth follow between those points. So to create that smooth follow, I will use utilities float curve node. This will help us to remap the spline parameter factor based on a curve. I will create a point in the middle, drag the endpoint to 0 and this middle point all the way up to 1. You can use few more points to control the curve or these handle options, but here I stick with this. Now you can see the effect clearly when I increase the points and reduce the scale of the noise texture. So we can control our distortion scale, strength, and also resolution. Now I want to animate the noise texture to animate the distortion. But changing the scale will change the look of the distortion. So instead of changing the scale, I like to change the offset. For that, I change the texture type to 4D to get this W input. Now we can use this to change the noise offset. Right now we are using two scale nodes. Let's simplify that like this. I add a multiply node from our curve and use it as scale node input. Then Ctrl X to delete the second scale node without breaking the connection. Organize the nodes like this. Now this second value in the multiply node will control the strength of the distortion. It's basically the same thing as before, but I like it this way. Now I need to animate the offset with time. Also, I want to create a more user-friendly geo setup. I don't want the user to come to the geo setup and then find the noise texture to find this W to animate the offset. It is too much work and also unnecessary. We can ease those steps by using input scene time node. This will give us the current time in the timeline from both seconds and frames. Hit Ctrl Shift click on the node to get a viewer node. We need to plug a geometry to see the values. You can see in the viewer column we have the current time in seconds, 0.083. How is that? Well, we are in the second frame in the timeline and our project is 24 fps. So 2 divided by 24 will give us our current time in seconds. And you can see it changes when I change the frame. At frame 24, value will be 1, 2 at the 48th frame and 2.5 at 60th frame. Like that. Frame will give us the frame number and that won't depend on the project's frame rate. I will plug the seconds to W input. Now when I hit play, it works. What if I want to change the speed? Well, I can use a multiply node here. Later we can extract this input out so the user can change the speed easily without coming to the geo setup. Remember that code? Let's organize this. Now we need to convert this to something we can see in the render view. We need to give this curve a thickness. For that, use a curve to mesh node and convert our curve to a mesh. Add a curve circle and plug it to profile curve socket. This turned our lightning branch into a distorted tube. We can change the tube radius from this radius value. Let's keep it like this. But I want my lightning to have a bigger thickness in the start and at the end have a zero thickness or something very low. But you can see this radius input has this circular shape. It is not a field input. I mean, it makes sense because after all, this node gives us a circle and a circle only has one radius. So how do we add a different radius to each point of the curve? Well, for that, I can use curve set curve radius node. Don't worry, our curve is not gone anywhere. It just has a very small thickness. Let's set this to 1. You can see, although it says 1 meter radius, you can clearly see that it is not what we are getting. That is because, and I have said this a few times before in my tutorials, that these two nodes work together when they are like this. Our final mesh radius will be our curve radius multiplied with our profile curve circles radius. So in this case, 1 multiplied by 0.06 meters, resulting 0.06 meter radius. Now, since we have the set curve radius node, we can set a different radius for each point of the curve. I want a thick start and a pointy end. So let's use the spline parameter node, which gives us 0 to 1 value range along the curve. Plug this factor to radius. You can see we have 0 radius at start and full radius at the end. But it is the opposite of what we want. So let's invert this spline parameter value. There are a few ways to do this, but I like to use a float curve again and flip the curve like this. I like to have more thickness at the start, so I change the curve a bit. Now, what if you don't want 0 radius at the end? What if you want a bit of thickness? Well, you have come here and changed the curve. That is definitely not very user friendly, right? Not many people like curves, and also it's not easy to do. So, like before, I like to create a value that users can control from outside. To create that, add a color mix node. We can use this to mix two colors. But here I like to use it to mix two values. We only care about this value number in the color. We can use this slider to switch between our 0 radius end and more thickened end. So when the slider at 0, I want the color 1 to have a value of 1. At the value of 1, I want to have this radius be created. Now plug this to radius. Now if you want full thickness radius, set the mix value to 0. If you want 0 radius at the end, set it to 1. And the best thing is, you can pick in between those two values, which probably will be what most of you prefer. Somewhere around 0.8 is my favorite. Remember the wise man? Now let's take a look at these corners. You can see they are definitely not smooth. They are very much blocky. So there are again few ways to smooth it out. And I want to show you two methods which gives two different looks. You can pick what you like. Let me make some space. I do this after the distortion. Add set spline type node and set handle type node. Put the spline type node here and set the type to Bezier. Add the handle type node. Now you can see it looks more smooth now, before and after. I don't know about you guys, but for me, this is too smooth. This could work in so many scenarios, but I don't think lightning looks like this. And also, since this basically takes a curve and changes its spline type, we don't really have a way to control it. It's like taking a PNG and converting it to a JPEG. Both are images but different. We don't have a way to pick 50% JPEG or 30% PNG. Well, that probably is not the best example. However, I think you can get the idea. So, I don't delete this. Some of you may prefer this over the next method. I frame it and label it method 1. Mute it. So, we have our non-smooth lightning branch. For the second method, I only need a one node. Curve, fillet curve. Choose the poly method and check this limit radius box. This is basically a vertex bevel for curves. You can change the radius to control the bevel amount and count to make it smoother by adding a few points. Usually I go with a count of 3 and radius of about 0.1. You can use this radius to control the smoothness. Here is a quick before and after. Let's call this method 2 and this whole thing smoothness. Wise man, remember? We got our lightning branch, but what is lightning without its glow? So let's create a material. It doesn't really matter where you create the material, you just need to have it in your project. I call this m_lightning. To add this to our branch, here just at the end, I add a set material node and select our material. Now to deal with our material, let's go to the shading workspace and delete the principal node. We don't need that. Add an emission shader node. I make the lightning blue. I actually prefer not to go all the way to the edge of the color wheel. Pick a color with just a bit less saturated. Set the strength to a big number. Let's go with 50. Now in Eevee, I set the world color to black. And look at that. This is our lightning. You can change the strength and change the color. But don't you feel like it's a shame that we did all the work inside geometry nodes, but there's nothing we can use from there that could help us in the materials? Well, there's a way. Right now I have one uniform color across the lightning. What if I want the starting color to be light blue and the end color to be a bit darker or any different color? With the spline parameter in our geometry nodes, we can create a gradient from start to finish. But how do we access it inside the shade editor? That's when this store attribute node comes in. Here we can plug any values from a certain geometry and give it a name and store it in the geometry. Then in the shade editor, we can use an attribute node and type that name to access that data from the geometry. So let's do that. Here I drag our modified spline parameter and plug it to the value socket. Our spline parameter is a float, so we don't need to change that. You can keep the domain as point. In the name slot, you can call it any name. I call it parameter. Then I put this node in between the set curve radius node and curve to mesh node. Because we are accessing our spline parameter data from the curve. Once it is converted to mesh, it no longer has spline parameter data. Because it is a mesh and spline parameter only gives us curve data. So just like that, we access the spline parameter data and store it as an attribute under the name parameter. I hover my cursor over the name and hit Ctrl C to copy the name. Now in the shade editor, we can just paste that name in our attribute node and hit Ctrl Shift click to get a viewer node. Now you can see we have our spline parameter data as a gradient, white at the start and black at the end. Now I use a color mix node and create two colors and use the attribute as the factor and use the output as our emission color. Look at that. You can change those colors to anything you like. Now, when lightning happens, they do not just suddenly appear, right? They kind of look like that because of the immense speed, but they actually strike. They start from a certain point and quickly hit another point, resulting in lightning strike. So, how do we create that striking effect? Actually, it is super easy. All you have to do is in the Geo Node setup, use the curve trim curve node and change this end value to trim the curve. When you start to go from 0 to 1, you get that striking effect. But let me show you something. Let's change our radius factor to 1. Now I want you to look at the end of the curve when I start trimming. It does what it should, right? But now look at what it does when I put the trim curve node before we change our curve radius. You can see even at the halfway stage, our endpoint stays at the radius of 0, which is what we want. This way we can add a bit of growing effect to our branch. This is really handy when you are creating a plant growing animation or something like that. This is happening because now the spline parameter node we use to adjust the radius is actually getting data from the trimmed curve. Once it is trimmed, whatever the current endpoint will have the value of 1 from the spline parameter. Before that, it was getting it from the original curve. So I call this striking. Maybe not the best names, but whatever. You can change the lightning color, but when you want to change the color or strength of the lightning, you have to go inside the material and change it. Again, not that user friendly. I want all that stuff to be controlled in one place. I told you before that we can extract values from our geometry node, and I also showed you how to transfer values between materials and geometry. So let's use that. Duplicate the store attribute node. It doesn't really matter where you put it because we are not accessing any data from the geometry. We're just going to input it by ourselves. Change the type to color. Give it a suitable name. Let's call it lightning color. Select a color you like. Copy the attribute name because I don't want to misspell it. In the material, duplicate the attribute node and paste the name. View the node. And just like that, we have a way to control the lightning color from Geo Node setup. You can test it from here. Go to render view and change the color. What about the second color? Well, you can create another store attribute node, but here I just use a hue saturation value node and change the hue just a bit to use as my second color. You can see both data we transferred working nicely. But what about the emission strength? We can use the same method and create another store attribute node, but let's do it a bit differently this time. You can see we can store a few different data types, right? And we can access them inside materials, especially factor and color, which we already use, and also vector. And best thing about vectors is they can store 3 values at once for each axis, x, y, and z. This spline parameter we used before is just a one value range. What if we use it as one axis of a vector and use another axis to store our lightning strength? So let's use a vector combine xyz node. Change the attribute type to vector. Plug this vector to value and plug our spline parameter to x input. Let's use z as our lightning strength. I type 50. Now in the material, I separate our vector using separate xyz node. X-axis is our spline parameter. So let's plug it here and plug the z-axis, which is our strength, to emission strength. And just like that, we got it to work. I can change the strength from the geometry node setup. So we started by creating a curve that is stuck to 2 points. We distorted each point, we make them animate, we smooth out the distortion, we create a striking effect, we create a radius fall off along the curve, we stored a few data from the setup, we turned our curve into a mesh for some thickness, and finally assigned a material. Otherwise, man, let's frame this as well. I told you a few times that I can extract values out. So let's do this. Remember the first node we deleted when we started our setup? Yeah, I want it back. Go to group input node. You can see this blank socket and you can plug anything to here and extract it over to our modifier. So that is what I'm going to do. Let's extract our target object. You can see it now showing up in the modifier. To adjust it more, hit N to bring up the properties panel. Here in the group tab, in the input selection, I can set some settings. I change the name to target. I can also add a tooltip, a default object. Now, I duplicate the group input node and extract our point count. You can drag from the same input node, but I like it this way. Just like before, you can set some settings for that particular input. And I continue doing it for every single value I want. When I want a slider instead of adding a new float input, I always drag from that slider input to create a slider in the modifier, because the other way only gives me a value input, not a slider. They both float type, but one is a slider input. So if you want to create a slider, then create an input by dragging from a slider. Let's continue creating new inputs. Once you extract everything and change their names to make sense, then you can go ahead and move them up or down to change their order. And that's it. But I really do not like this huge group input node we have everywhere. We are not even using most of the inputs every time. So what I do is I select that node and hit Ctrl H to hide unused sockets. Do that for every single group input node. So just like that, we have ourselves a fully procedural, fully finished lightning branch. Now we can easily move on to creating bigger lightning effects with more branches and more functionality. I mean, we got all the necessary steps covered. Now it's just a matter of using them to create those big effects. But if you're not someone who likes to wait till my next part of the video where I create this directional lighting, you can head over to my Gumroad page and grab the free version of the Ultimate Lighting Pack. Play with it and see if you can figure it out by yourself. Not that difficult. And if you're more interested in these lightnings, then you can spend just $2 to grab the whole lightning pack. Oh, by the way, don't forget to take a look at my Ultimate Suit Up pack. It also has a free and extra version with 5-star rating. So I hope you learned something new, something useful. I mean, that's what we like to do. We not only create stuff, we let you create with us. Hit the like button and subscribe to HelpX Learn so you won't miss out when the next part of the lightning effects drop. Huge thanks to our awesome patrons, and until we meet next time, check these videos out. You're going to love them.